Good afternoon. Welcome to The Analyst. Today we'll be taking up 7 newspaper articles from The Hindu and The Indian Express and discussing them. The handout for the same will be available in the description of this video for your kind perusal. Please have a look at that. The first article that we'll take up is related to the Constitution 130th Amendment Bill, which was introduced in the Lok Sabha amid protests. The bill seeks to remove the ministers who are facing allegations of serious offences and are arrested or detained in custody for at least 30 days. The second article is related to transgender rights, as the Manipur High Court in a significant judgment ordered the state to issue fresh academic certificates for Beyonce Laishram. Additionally, we'll take up 5 articles in the simplified section which will be helpful for your prelims and mains preparation. The first article is related to the Constitution 130th Amendment Bill, which was introduced in the Lok Sabha amid protests. The bill seeks to remove the ministers of the central government, the state governments, as well as the union territories who are facing the allegations of having committed a serious offence, which attracts the punishment of 5 years or more jail time, and who have been arrested or detained in custody for more than 30 days. But there are concerns that this bill may adversely impact federalism and even violate the due process of law in India. So we will discuss both the arguments in favor of this bill and the arguments against this bill. We'll also have a look at some judicial precedents in the past aimed at decriminalization of politics. This is important in GS2 under the topic Appointments to various constitutional posts, powers, functions and responsibilities of the constitutional bodies. Now the bill seeks to amend the Article 75, Article 164 and Article 239AA of the Constitution. Before coming to the provisions of the bill, let's look at the current status, the current provisions regarding the appointment and the removal of the ministers in India. Under Article 75, subclause 1 specifically, the Prime Minister is appointed by the President and the other ministers, they are also appointed by the President on the advice of the Prime Minister. Regarding their removal, under Article 75, clause 5 specifically, the minister ceases to be a minister in case he is no longer a member of the either house of the parliament for a period of 6 months consecutively. Now, how are the members of the parliament disqualified? For the disqualification of the MPs, the provisions are provided under Article 102 of the Constitution. Under Article 102, Clause 1, an MP can be disqualified if he is holding an office of profit under the government, or if he is declared as a person of unsound mind, or if he is declared as an undischarged insolvent, or if he acquires the citizenship of another country voluntarily or gives up the Indian citizenship voluntarily, or if the MP is disqualified by any law enacted by the parliament, for example the Representation of the People's Act. Also under subclause 2 of Article 102, the member of parliament can also be disqualified under the anti-defection law, the 10th schedule specifically. Now coming to the disqualification due to the criminal offences specifically, under section 8 subclause 3 of the Representation of the People's Act, if a legislator, a member of the parliament, is convicted of having committed an offence which attracts a punishment of 2 years or more, then that member of parliament or the legislator shall be disqualified. Earlier there was another provision also which was inserted in the Representation of People's Act, section 8 subclause 4, which provided a window of 3 months to the disqualified legislator to appeal against the conviction. Then there won't be any disqualification and the lawmaker can remain in office, the MP or MLA can remain in office. But the section 8 subclause 4 of the Representation of People's Act was deemed to be unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in Lily Thomas versus Union of India. Now the current status is that the MP or MLA, if they have been convicted of having committed an offence which attracts a punishment of 2 years or more, then they shall be immediately disqualified. And if a minister is no longer an MP for 6 months or more consecutively, then he ceases to be a minister. Now, what amendments does the current bill propose? It proposes that a minister who is arrested for 30 consecutive days or more of having committed an offense under any law which is punishable with imprisonment of 5 years or more, then that minister shall be removed by the president on the advice of the prime minister. In case the advice is not tendered by the prime minister, then in any case by the 31st day he shall cease to be a minister. In case it is the prime minister who is arrested for 30 days or more of having committed an offense which again attracts a punishment of 5 years or more under the law, then the prime minister shall have to tender his resignation by the 31st day after such arrest or detention. Otherwise, if the resignation is not tendered, then he shall cease to be the prime minister. Also, importantly, the amendment bill provides that there shall be no stopping of the reappointment. That is, the person who is arrested and detained for more than 30 days and he is removed from being a minister, he can be subsequently appointed again upon his release from the custody, whether he was the prime minister, the chief minister, or the minister. Now, importantly, the earlier provision under section 8 clause 3, which provided for the disqualification regarding the criminal offences, the disqualification was attracted after the conviction. But the current amendment bill provides that the removal shall happen after the arrest itself, even though the person has not been convicted by the court, provided that the arrest is for 30 consecutive days or more. And the same provisions, they have been extended to the states as well as the union territories by proposing amendments to the article 164 as well as the article 239AA. Now, what are the reasons behind this amendment bill? Let's look at the statement of objects and the reasons also. It provides that the elected representatives, the MPs, MLAs, they represent the hopes and the aspirations of the people of India. They have to function by rising above the political interests, and they have to function only in the public interest, only for the welfare of the people. This is some good vocabulary which has been used in the bill, and it provides that the character and the conduct of the ministers has to be beyond any ray of suspicion, and they have to ensure that the canons of constitutional morality are to be upheld. And if a minister is arrested or is detained in custody and is facing allegations of serious criminal offences, then this may thwart or hinder the canons of constitutional morality itself, and the principles of good governance may not be upheld then, and this will eventually diminish the constitutional trust which has been reposed by the people in the minister. But there are no provisions under the constitution for the removal of a minister who has been arrested or detained in custody on account of serious criminal charges. Now this bill seeks to provide this provision as well. Now, what are the arguments in favor of the Constitution 130th Amendment Bill? One, it is the right of a citizen to be governed by the people who are not having criminal antecedents or criminal background. Because if the ministers are themselves facing serious criminal charges, it will be analogous to a situation where the lawmakers are themselves the lawbreakers as well. And also it is the constitutional obligation, the constitutional duty which is cast upon the prime minister to ensure that the people having criminal background or criminals are not recommended to be appointed as ministers by the president. And at the state government level, it shall be the duty of the chief minister to ensure that the people with criminal antecedents are not appointed as the ministers in the government. We can apply the doctrine of implied limitation as well. For example, when we look at the Article 75 Clause 1 specifically, the very language of Article 75 Clause 1 provides that the ministers shall be appointed by the president on the advice of the prime minister. Now, the framers of the constitution definitely did not envision that the advice will be provided regarding the appointment of the people with criminal antecedents as the ministers in the government. Likewise, the limitations upon the appointment as ministers may not be explicit, but there are implicit limitations provided by the Constitution. For example, the Constitution allows a person to be appointed as a minister even though that person may not be a member of the parliament or the member of the state legislature, but the person can be appointed as a minister for a period of 6 months. But that does not mean that the person can be reappointed again and again for a period of 6 months at a time without him being elected as a member of the legislature any time. So there is an implied limitation. Also, we can apply the doctrine of good governance. The doctrine of good governance requires that the people should not be of criminal background. The ministers in the government, they should not have criminal antecedents. Otherwise, ensuring good governance may be a distant dream. The Latin maxim Salus Populi Suprema Lex provides that the supreme law shall be to ensure the welfare of the people, which has to be the paramount consideration. The Law Commission report on the electoral disqualification, initially the 170th report, then the 244th report, also provided that the disqualification of the legislators, if it happens at the stage of conviction, it has proved ineffective in countering the criminalization of politics. Therefore, the disqualification can happen at an earlier stage. The Law Commission provided that the disqualification can happen at the stage of the framing of the charges, that the framing of the charges is done by the judiciary. Therefore, by that stage, there has been an application of the judicial mind. The prima facie judicial satisfaction has been achieved, that the judiciary is satisfied that there is sufficient material to send the person on trial. That is why the charges have been framed by the court. Therefore, the disqualification of the legislator can happen after the application of the judicial mind at the stage of the framing of the charges, as per the recommendation of the Law Commission 244th report, the report on the electoral disqualification. The Law Commission had even recommended that the filing of the false affidavits should also be punished. The filing of false affidavits can be punished with 2 years imprisonment, and this must be made as a ground for disqualification. The filing of false affidavits also must be made a ground for disqualification as per the Law Commission report. There are other arguments also in favor of the Constitution 130th Amendment Bill. For example, it will create deterrence, a deterrence against the criminalization of politics. As the people who are aspiring to become ministers in the government, they will be dissuaded from engaging in the criminal activities. Therefore, the criminalization of politics may go down, and it will discourage the nepotism and dynastic politics also, because the sons and daughters of the sitting ministers or the legislators who are facing serious criminal offences, they may not be made ministers. The international precedents also point towards it. For example, in Kyrgyzstan, the people who are in confinement, they are having no right to be elected as ministers, and they lose the moral authority to govern as well if they are facing serious criminal charges and they are having criminal antecedents. And the data on disqualification provides that in the past, only 27 sitting MPs or MLAs have been disqualified so far since 2013 till today. Therefore, the disqualification happens quite late and the conviction rate is also quite low. But there are certain arguments against the Constitution 130th Amendment Bill. For example, it does not follow the principle of Indian criminal jurisprudence, which presumes innocence, that is, innocent until proven guilty. Here there is no presumption of innocence, because the removal from ministership happens even before the trial is completed. The removal happens merely on the basis of arrest for a period of 30 days or more, merely on the basis of unproven charges, because the trial has not been completed. Also, it may violate the principle of natural justice, as the principle of natural justice requires that every person has the right to be heard, has to be provided a fair opportunity of hearing. But that may be violated. The principle of natural justice, odi alteram partem, may be violated because before the completion of the trial, the removal already has happened. And it is not only the right of the sitting minister which has been violated through this, rather it is the will of the people also which may be disregarded, because it disrupts the mandate. The minister has been chosen by the people, and the removal from ministership may also be seen as a disruption of the electoral mandate. And it may be seen as a probable weaponization of the investigative agencies by the central government also. The opposition has alleged that the investigative agencies like the Central Bureau of Investigation, the Enforcement Directorate, they may be utilized to destabilize the opposition state governments, and it may even violate the due process of law, because again the removal happens before the completion of the trial, and the conviction rates on top of it are low. For example, particularly in the cases filed by the Enforcement Directorate and the arrests made by it, the conviction rates are very low. And it is seen as a threat to federalism as well by the opposition, as it may be used to target the opposition state governments where the state government is formed by the opposition parties, and there are lack of safeguards as well. In the bill, there are no safeguards against the probable misuse which may happen, the misuse of the arrest for a period of 30 days or more and the subsequent removal. And also this bill is contradicting the Supreme Court precedent. For example, in Lily Thomas versus Union of India case, the court had observed that the disqualification shall only happen after the conviction has taken place. The Law Commission recommendations regarding the disqualification at the stage of the framing of charges, that has not been yet framed into a law. Therefore, that was not taking place. The disqualification was happening until now only after the conviction has been done. And it also ignores the judicial discretion. For example, sometimes the court may deny bail even to the sitting ministers or MLAs based upon not the proof that they are guilty, rather on the presumption that they may influence the case in case they are given bail. And it also is alleged by the opposition that it is a diversion by the government from the real issues, as the opposition is alleging regarding the electoral issues. Now let's also have a look at some case laws, the contributions of judiciary in ensuring decriminalization of politics in India. One in the Union of India versus Association for Democratic Reforms in 2002, the court observed that the voters have a right to know. They have the right to be informed regarding the antecedents of the people who are contesting elections, the right to know regarding their criminal past, the criminal charges they have been framed against in the past. And it directed the Election Commission to secure the affidavits from the contestants regarding the criminal charges that they have faced in the past. The court had observed that only if they know regarding the antecedents of the contestants, the voters will be able to effectively exercise their right to freedom of speech and expression, the freedom of expression, as they are voting under Article 19, Clause 1, Clause A. In PUCL versus Union of India case in 2004, the court struck down Section 33B of the Representation of Peoples Act, as the Section 33B of the Representation of Peoples Act effectively overturned the earlier judgment, as it provided that the candidates do not need to submit the affidavit regarding their past criminal charges to the Election Commission of India, but the court struck down this Section 33B of the RPA. In K. Prabhakaran versus P. Jayarajan, the court observed that the Section 8, Clause 3 of the Representation of Peoples Act applied even if the conviction was stayed or overturned after the date of the nomination. The Section 8, Clause 3 of the Representation of Peoples Act provides that if a person is convicted for an offence which attracts a punishment of 2 years or more, then he shall be disqualified, the legislator shall be disqualified. The court in this case had observed that even though the conviction may be stayed after the date of nomination, but the disqualification stays. And the court had observed here that the intent behind the disqualification provisions has to be seen, that the intent is to ensure that the people with criminal background are not entering into politics. And in Lily Thomas versus Union of India case, the court had provided that there shall be immediate disqualification if the conviction takes place. Therefore, Section 8, Clause 4 of the Representation of Peoples Act was held to be unconstitutional, as it was providing a leeway, a window to the legislators to file an appeal within a period of 3 months of conviction and then remain in the office. In Manoj Narula versus Union of India case, the court observed that we cannot read a disqualification into Article 75, Clause 1. Even if the person is facing serious charges of moral turpitude or serious criminal offences, we cannot read that disqualification into the Article 75 clause 1, but there is a legitimate expectation from the Prime Minister that he shall not be appointing the persons who are facing serious criminal charges as ministers in the government. In the Public Interest Foundation versus Union of India case in 2018, the court observed that the candidates cannot be disqualified against whom criminal charges have been framed. The Law Commission had earlier recommended that at the stage of the framing of charges, the disqualification should happen. But the court observed that there is no statute which is saying so. Therefore, the disqualification shall happen after the conviction only. In Ram Babu Singh Thakur versus Sunil Arora case in 2020, the Supreme Court observed that it will be the duty of the political parties that they will have to upload the details regarding the pending criminal cases against their MPs or MLAs on their respective websites. They will also have to publish it in a newspaper, and they will also have to give reasons why they chose the people with criminal antecedents as candidates and they got elected then. In V. Senthil Balaji case, the case where there was an allegation for cash for job scam, the court initially gave bail to the minister after he was arrested, but after that the minister was reinstated as a minister, but the ED recommended that the bail should be cancelled. Then the court observed that either you choose freedom or you choose your post, that either you should resign from your post of minister or you should risk the cancellation of bail, because there are chances that you may influence the case proceedings if you are again appointed as a minister upon getting bail. In Arvind Kejriwal case also, in the liquor policy case, the Arvind Kejriwal was barred from signing official documents and even entering government offices as well after he was given bail. So these are some of the initiatives which were taken up by the judiciary in ensuring decriminalization of politics in India, and the Constitution 130th Amendment Bill is also an attempt in this regard, but now it has been referred to the Joint Committee of the Parliament and there may be further amendments to the proposal. Now, there is a mains practice question also. Discuss the changes proposed by the Constitution 130th Amendment Bill 2025. Give arguments both in favor of and against the amendment and refer to the relevant judicial decisions on criminalization of politics and the disqualification of legislators. Please try to write it. The next article is related to the transgender rights. The context behind it is that the Manipur High Court, in a significant decision, directed the state to issue fresh academic certificates for Beyonce Laisharam. So we will discuss the transgender rights in India, the Transgender Persons Act 2019, the issues that the transgenders face, the government initiatives for the protection and betterment of the transgenders, and a few suggestions in this regard. This is important in GS2 under the topic welfare schemes for the vulnerable sections of the population, mechanisms, laws, institutions and bodies constituted for the protection and betterment of these vulnerable sections of the population. As per the 2011 census, there are about 6 lakh transgenders in India, and there are constitutional provisions also for safeguarding their rights. For example, Article 14 provides for the right to equality, and Article 15 provides that there shall be no discrimination on the grounds of sex, and Article 19 subclause 1 subclause A provides for the freedom of speech and expression. The freedom of expression includes the freedom of having a gender identity or the freedom of having a particular sexual orientation as well. Article 21 provides for the right to privacy. It has been implicitly read into Article 21 after the Puttaswamy judgment, and the transgender's right to privacy is also protected thus. There are a few judicial interventions, the case laws for the protection of the transgender rights in the past. For example, in Naz Foundation versus the NCT of Delhi case in 2009, the court observed that the Section 377 of the erstwhile IPC offended Article 14. It violated the right to equality for the transgenders because it provided for an unreasonable classification, and unreasonable classification treating the homosexuals as a class here amounted to the violation of their right to equality under Article 14 of the Constitution. In Nalsa versus Union of India case in 2014, the court held that the right of all persons should be respected, the right of the transgenders also to self-identify their gender, and the government was directed to recognize the third gender as the socio-economically backward class and provide them with reservations also, which has not been done. In Navtej Singh Johar versus Union of India in 2018, the court observed that Section 377 infringed on the fundamental rights of autonomy, intimacy, and identity as well. The government enacted the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act 2019. The act provided for the definition that the transgenders shall be the persons for whom the gender is not the same which is assigned at birth. It provided for the provisions for the protection of their rights. For example, it prohibits the discrimination against transgenders, the discrimination in employment and education. It allows the transgenders for the self-perception of their gender identity. They can choose their gender, but it has to be verified through a certificate of identity which is issued by the district magistrate. The act also criminalizes begging, and it prescribes the offences as well as their penalties, the offences against transgenders. The act also provides for the constitution of a national council for the transgender persons, for whom the chairperson shall be the Minister of Social Justice and Empowerment. Now, what will be the functions of the National Council? It will advise the government. It will advise the government regarding the policies, legislations, and the programs for the betterment and the protection of the transgender persons. It will also monitor and evaluate the impact, the performance of these policies and programs, and it will also function as the grievance redressal mechanisms for the grievances of the transgenders. But there are certain criticisms of this act as well. For example, it does not uphold the Nalsa judgment spirit altogether. The Nalsa judgment had provided that there should be self-determination which should be allowed for the transgenders. The act does provide for the self-perception of the gender identity, but the certificate of identity has to be issued by the district magistrate. The Nalsa judgment had recommended that there should be reservation which should be provided for the transgenders, but the act does not provide for a reservation for the transgenders. It only prohibits the discrimination in employment and education against the transgenders. Also, the act falls short of the protection and betterment initiatives. It does not provide a livelihood alternative. It criminalizes begging by the transgenders, but it is not providing a livelihood alternative. Then how will they earn? It is also silent on the civil rights of the transgenders. It does not provide for the provisions of the marriage, adoption, or succession among the transgenders. And the focus here is more on the trans women, whereas the focus on the intersex, genderqueer, etc. is missing. Plus, the punishment inequality is also seen. For the crimes committed against other genders, the punishment is unequal as compared to the crimes committed against the transgenders. There are other government initiatives as well aimed at the protection and betterment of the transgenders. The National Portal for Transgender Persons provides for a portal through which the transgenders can apply for the identity card, that from anywhere in India they can apply online through the portal for their transgender identity. The Grima Grihas are constructed. They are the shelter homes for the transgenders. They provide them shelter, food, medical care, recreational and capacity building and skill development activities as well, so that their reintegration into the society for the rescued transgenders can be done effectively. Kerala is the first state which came up with the transgender policy. It has a program Samanvay, which is an educational program through which in the arts and science colleges 2 seats are reserved in the courses for the transgender persons. Odisha came up with the Swikruti scheme. It is an umbrella scheme in the state of Odisha which provides the enabling environment for the transgenders. So they can also go for equal participation, equal opportunities are provided and equities ensured in the participation for the transgender persons. The SMILE scheme was floated by the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment. It has 2 components. One is a central sector scheme for the welfare and rehabilitation of the transgenders who are engaging in begging. Another is also a central sector scheme that is providing for scholarships, and also the skill development and livelihood is provided under the PM Daksh scheme. But there are certain issues which the transgender persons still face. For example, they face the issue of discrimination. They are discriminated against often and looked down upon in the society, and they face the stigma as well. Therefore there are high dropout rates in the schools among the transgender children, and there is exploitation as well which happens, including the sexual exploitation as well as exclusion from the mainstream society. There is a lack of awareness also among the transgender persons. They are not aware regarding the welfare schemes which are put in place by the government, and they are not aware about their rights as well. There is a lack of sensitivity in general in the society regarding the transgender issues and their special problems. There is a high poverty rate as well, which is prevalent among the transgenders. Therefore they are compelled to engage in prostitution or begging. Also, the homosexuality is a criminal offense in a lot of countries. In more than 70 countries, it is treated as a criminal offense, and in 6% of the countries in the world, it is even punishable with death. And the transgender persons, they are often victims of isolation as well as drug abuse, because they are having low self-confidence, low self-esteem. Therefore they fall victims to the drug abuse. They are often having the health issues and health complications because of having poor access to the healthcare services, and often the high prevalence of the HIV/AIDS among the transgender persons. Now, what are the suggestions that we can give for the protection of the rights of the transgenders and for their welfare? One, the gender education can be promoted in the schools from an early age itself to develop the sensitivity towards the transgender children and the transgender persons. The political participation of the transgenders can be encouraged so that they have a say in the policy making, in the decision making, and for the implementation, effective implementation of the schemes targeted at the welfare of the transgender persons. Also, there can be a constitution of a welfare board, a transgender welfare board in every state, to ensure that the grievance redressal mechanisms are effective, and the welfare schemes can be put in place for gender minorities, specifically, for example, targeting housing, targeting the welfare of the transgender persons, the homeless transgenders. For them, the housing schemes can be floated. The religious institutions can also be tapped into, because they have the power to influence the societal attitude towards the transgenders. And there can be the gender neutral sexual harassment related laws. For that, legal reforms can be taken up, and there can be an anti-discrimination law also which can be put in place specifically for the transgenders. There is a means practice question also. Despite constitutional guarantees and recent legislative measures, the transgender community in India continues to face systemic discrimination and marginalization. Discuss the challenges faced by the transgender persons and suggest measures to ensure their full social, economic, and political inclusion. Please try to write it. The next article is related to the Online Gaming Bill 2025. It has been cleared by the Lok Sabha recently. This is important in GS2 under the topic governance, and in GS3 as well under the topic Indian economy. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few basics regarding the online gaming in India. There are different types of online games. There are e-sports, for example, PUBG, like FIFA, the online games, and then there are fantasy based online games, for example Dream 11, My 11 Circle, and then there are some skill based games also, for example online chess. These are skill based games. When we look at the data regarding online gaming in India, they are a major revenue generator. In fiscal year 2023, they generated a revenue of more than $3 billion in India, and they are having a good growth rate also. From fiscal year 2020 to 2023, there has been a compounded annual growth rate of 28%, which is significant. And India is also home to the second largest number of online gamers as well in the world. And in the case of state of Andhra Pradesh versus K. Satyanarayanan, the Supreme Court had agreed to the distinction between the game of skill and the game of chance. The Supreme Court had observed that the game of skill is not considered as gambling. Now, coming to the recent bill, it provides that the online money game can be defined as a service which is played by a user by paying fees, by depositing money or other stakes in the expectation of winning, which entails monetary or other enrichment in return of money or other stakes, but it is not including the esports within it. It is different from esports. Now coming to the bill, the Promotion and Regulation of Online Gaming Bill 2025, it prohibits the offering, operation, facilitation, advertisement, promotion and participation in the online money games. The bill does not distinguish between the game of chance and the game of skill. It makes that distinction irrelevant and it seeks to ban all online money gaming. It provides for the imprisonment of a term up to 3 years and a fine up to 1 crore for the entities who are offering the online money gaming. And it also prohibits the advertisement also related to online money gaming, and it bars the banks and financial institutions from transferring funds for any of such games. Even the advertisement has been banned, and the advertisement can attract imprisonment of up to 2 years and fine of up to 50 lakhs. And the facilitating of the financial transactions for the online money gaming can also lead to imprisonment up to 3 years and a fine of 1 crore. So there has been a blanket ban which the bill proposes to impose upon the online money gaming in India. Now, what is the rationale behind the ban on the online money gaming in India, the blanket ban? Because it leads to addiction, and the addiction is akin to the addiction for gambling, which may lead to the wiping out of savings. People's lifetime savings have been wiped out, and the algorithms that they use, the algorithms that are used by the online money gaming apps and websites, they are opaque. Therefore there are chances of fraud. The frauds may remain undetected and therefore cheating happens, and therefore the people who are playing, they become victims of loan sharks thereafter, because they have gambled, they have betted a lot, and then they commit suicides. There is another angle of national security also, because through these apps the money is transferred via digital wallets or sometimes via the cryptocurrencies also, and then that is used for money laundering. And these apps provide for the communication setup also, for example the messaging platform, and that messaging is used for communication by the terrorist organizations also. The online money gaming apps and websites, through that the terror organizations, they communicate with each other via the messaging platform, and the offshore entities, they also utilize it to evade tax. Therefore they have been banned in India. Now the bill also envisions the creation of a central authority, to promote the competitive esports, because esports, they are not included in the online money gaming, to ensure the overall compliance also. Therefore the central government will recognize, categorize and register the online social games with the authority, and they will facilitate the development and availability of such games for the recreational and educational purposes. Now the gaming bill also, just like the income tax bill, it allows the authorized officials to carry out the search operations at the physical and virtual places even without a warrant. But there are certain concerns also regarding the ban on the online money gaming. For example, it can be challenged in the court on the ground of the trade restriction. There is the right to freedom of trade as well under the Article 19 subclause 1 itself. And it may lead to a death blow being given to the online gaming industry in India, and it is projected that the online gaming industry in India will be having a turnover of $9 billion by 2029. Also on the online gaming in India, 28% GST is levied, and it leads to the revenue of 15 to 20,000 crore rupees. That revenue will be lost if it is banned altogether, and now there was a proposal to increase it to 40% also. Plus the online money gaming, it is like a sunrise sector in India. It has attracted FDI also, the foreign direct investment. By June 2022 itself, about 25,000 crore foreign direct investment was attracted into India via the online money gaming industry. And it creates jobs as well. About 2 lakh direct and indirect jobs are created via the online money gaming. The next article is related to the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the phase 2 of which is set to be launched soon. This is important in GS2 under the topic India and its neighborhood relations. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor passes through the Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. Therefore, it affects Indian sovereignty and territorial integrity, and therefore India has been against this initiative. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor extends from the Kashgar in China to Gwadar port in Pakistan. And China has the interest in the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor because it is the flagship project under the Belt and Road Initiative of China. And through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, it is able to trade via the Indian Ocean with the Middle East and the European countries. And it is its effective route to the Indian Ocean. Plus, it helps China in the stabilization of the Xinjiang region. And it also persecutes the Uyghur minority. Uyghur minority is a Muslim minority in China, but by establishing the linkages to the Indian Ocean region through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and by investing in the infrastructure development in Pakistan, it is having Pakistan on its side, and Pakistan does not criticize the persecution of the Uyghur minorities by China. And a stronger Pakistan would be advantage for China over its strategic competitor India. That is what China has been believing when it was investing in the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and by extension the United States also. It will be having a strategic advantage over the USA by investing in the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and the Belt and Road Initiative projects. Also, the port of Gwadar, it is treated like the jewel of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. But there are certain issues which the CPEC has faced in the past. For example, the funds were short in the past to build the new coal-fired power plants, and even after they were built, there were stalled projects also for the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. That there were reports of corruption in Pakistan and even terrorist attacks on the infrastructure that was built by China in Pakistan. And Pakistan itself is going through an economic crisis. The current account deficit of Pakistan keeps on increasing. It is not able to pay for its imports also, and the materials which are used in the projects for the CPEC, they are also imported, and it leads to a balance of payment crisis for Pakistan, which has been bailed out by the International Monetary Fund multiple times in the past. Now, what are India's concerns regarding the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor? The primary concern is regarding the violation of sovereignty and territorial integrity, because the CPEC passes through the Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, and Kashmir is an integral part of India. Therefore, it violates our sovereignty and territorial integrity. And China has been pressing Pakistan to strengthen its control over the Pakistan-occupied areas of Kashmir, which is again inimical to India's interests. And through the control of Gwadar and via the construction of the Paira port in Bangladesh, China has been strengthening its presence all around India, and it is going for a debt trap diplomacy also. Through that, it gives extraordinarily high level of credits, and then when the country is not able to repay the debts, then they are extracting the economic or political concessions. For example, the leasing of the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. And therefore, that leads to the encirclement of India, the Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean region, increasing Chinese presence through its string of pearls strategy. The next article is related to the need for a national space law. This is important in GS3 under the topic awareness in the fields of information technology and space. The global space legislation is the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. It provides that the space is a province of all mankind. It does not belong to a single country. Therefore, it prohibits its national appropriation, that the appropriation should not be done by a single nation. It is like a global common, and it also places the responsibilities on its usage on the states, whether the usage is done by the states, the government entities, or the private entities. And its companion agreements, they are also creating a binding framework regarding the rights, liabilities, and the responsibility rules also. But these treaties, they are not self-executing. Rather, the means for their execution is through the national legislations through which the nations can give effect to these principles domestically. As the Outer Space Treaty, it provides for the foundational principles for all space activities, ensuring the peaceful use of space to the responsibility and the liability of the states. India has also ratified the key UN space treaties, but it is still in the process of enacting a comprehensive national space legislation. We have a national space policy. This policy signals intent, but we still do not have an enforceable structure which is created by a national space law. Now, coming to the national space legislation, it includes two aspects. One, the technical regulations which are usually framed for governing the space operations by the commercial entities. This is the first phase of the authorization process under the Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty. For that, we have taken steps. For example, the catalogue of Indian standards for the space industry has been created. It is critical for ensuring the safety in the space operations. We have a space policy which provides the details of the activities that the non-government entities are encouraged to undertake. The in-space norms have been created. They are the guidelines and the procedures for the implementation of the Indian Space Policy 2023. But what is pending is an overarching regulatory framework for which we need a national space law. Now, what is the need for a national space law? It will grant a statutory status to the in-space, and it will establish clear licensing rules. There will be clarity in the qualifications, processes, timelines, fees for applications that the commercial entities will have to pay for their registration, and there will be no regulatory delays. Right now there are regulatory delays because multiple ministries' approvals are required, and there are complications regarding the development of the dual use technology also. The national space law, if enacted, it will streamline the clearances, and the clearances for the development of the dual use technology will also be easier. Plus, it will attract the foreign direct investment also if there is definite regulatory mechanism which is put in place through the national space law. Also, we need a defined liability framework because the space startups, they need a third party insurance also for ensuring that the damages that they suffer, they are not huge, and the affordable insurance frameworks are there, because sometimes the startups are managing the high value assets. They need cheaper insurance also. Also, the national space law will help in ensuring that the intellectual property rights are secured. If the IPR rights are not secured, then there will be a fleeing of the brain and technology from India, because they will be fleeing then to those locations where the intellectual property rights are protected. Also, a national space law will create the binding safety standards which will promote safety and the institutionalization of the accident investigation procedures. It will enforce the space debris management as well, so that sustainable practices are adopted by both the government entities and the commercial entities, the space startups. It will help in the creation of unified data frameworks, because we need to put in place clear rules for the space related data and the satellite communications. It will help in the establishment of an independent appellate body to prevent the conflict of interest and providing the legal certainty, because the regulatory decisions then will be shielded from procedural challenges as they will be backed by the statutory backing. And it will help in the fulfillment of the international responsibilities also, thereby operationalizing India's commitments under the Outer Space Treaty. It will help in giving support to the commercial ecosystem growth as well, thereby creating a stable and predictable environment for the space startups to develop. The next article is related to the fertilizer stocks and issues related to fertilizers in India. This is important in GS3 under the topic issues related to direct and indirect farm subsidies. There has been a bountiful monsoon in India this year. The cumulative rainfall has been 2% above average in India. There have been normal rains except in Bihar and northeast region, which has led to an aggressive planting done by the farmers. It has led to the increase in the crop acreage. The sowing of the rice and the maize has picked up. It has led to the increase in the fertilizer demand also, particularly the nitrogenous fertilizer urea, which is used excessively in the paddy plantations. It has led to a supply shortfall. The reasons behind the supply shortfall include the declining urea imports. The urea imports from the 2021-2022 to 2024-2025 have declined by about 30%, and the imports from China fell to less than 2%, and simultaneously the global supplies have remained low. It has led to high international prices from $380 to $530 per ton. There are domestic production issues also. For example, plant shutdowns have taken place at Kakinada and Ramagundam, and also the production capacity, some of it has remained offline. When we look at the usage, the other aspect, paddy has 3 plus urea applications, and there is a high nitrogen requirement for paddy, maize and sugarcane. Also there is an impact because of the shift in the cropping pattern also. The shift in the cropping pattern from pulses and soybean to cereals has increased the demand for urea. Therefore, the fertilizer stocks in India are lower now. The urea, diammonium phosphate, muriate of potash, their complexes, they are lower than last year's stocks. Therefore, we can promote the usage of the nano urea and the urea gold. The nano urea is the urea in the form of a nanoparticle. The desirable particle size of about 20 to 50 nanometer, and it leads to more surface area, and it is produced by the IFFCO, Indian Farmers Fertilizer Cooperative. The conventional urea efficiency is about 25%, whereas the efficiency of the liquid nano urea is about 85 to 90%, leading to lower consumption of the nano urea. And the production process is also environmental friendly, and therefore it will lead to the reduction in the subsidy bill, simultaneously fulfilling the demand, the increased demand for urea. It will reduce the unbalanced and indiscriminate use of the conventional urea as well, therefore giving other advantages also, for example minimizing the soil pollution, air pollution and water pollution. Plus it gives the targeted supply of the nutrients to the crops, therefore sprayed directly on the leaves, foliar fertilization is encouraged and it gets absorbed as well. Another aspect is the urea gold. This is the urea which is fortified with sulfur. It was developed by the Rashtriya Chemicals and Fertilizers Limited, and the composition includes 37% nitrogen and 17% sulfur, whereas the regular urea includes 46% nitrogen. It therefore addresses the sulfur deficiency in the Indian soils, which is needed for the oil seeds and pulses, and it therefore also enhances the nitrogen use efficiency, as it leads to a gradual release of nitrogen as it has been coated with the sulfur. The next article is related to the India-China ties in the context of the imposition of tariffs upon India by USA. This is important in GS2 under the topic India and its neighborhood relations. This is the first ministerial visit from the side of China, the visit by Wang Yi after the October last year border disengagement decision. When we look at the history of the ties, the recent history particularly between India and China, it has gone through its share of highs and lows. First, there was the euphoria in 2019 created by the informal summit in Mahabalipuram. And then in 2020 there was a violent clash, the violent clash in the Galwan Valley, which led to some casualties also. But after that, therefore, there was a rupture in the ties. It led to a massive troop build-up from both sides, from India and China, and there was a multi-year standoff with reports of confrontations and infrastructure building by both India and China in that region. In mid-2024, there was a significant progress in the disengagement talks, and in October 2024 the agreement took place for disengaging in Depsang and the Demchok region. And post that, there were visits, high level visits from the side of India to China, as the External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar, the National Security Advisor Ajit Doval and the Defense Minister Rajnath Singh also visited China. The geopolitical catalyst behind the recent thaw in the ties between India and China can be seen to be the US elections also, as the Chinese had displayed a readiness for a confrontational stance also in case US gets confrontational, and the US tariffs which were imposed recently upon India, they accelerated the India-China thaw. And therefore there has been a resumption of the Kailash Mansarovar Yatra, as well as the issuance of the visas for the Chinese nationals for visiting India. Now there is a new strategy, the new dual track strategy, that is an agreement to progress on the border issues and at the same time the bilateral ties, but separately. And therefore there is a formation of 3 new border mechanisms for the disengagement between India and China: the expert group for the early harvest in the boundary delimitation so that it can be expedited, the working group for the effective border management, and a new general level mechanism for all the sectors. Therefore, there is a proposal to use the existing diplomatic and military mechanisms for the border management and de-escalation. Also, there is an agreement on a political perspective for the relationship and the boundary settlement. Therefore, there are a few bilateral re-engagement measures also taken up. For example, the resumption of the direct flight connectivity, the issuance of the visas for the tourists, businesses, and media, the reopening of the border trade at Lipu Lake, Shipkila, and the Nathula passes, the facilitation of trade and investment flows, and China will also be sharing the emergency hydrological data on the trans-border rivers as well. But there are certain concerns which are persisting. The concerns related to the trust deficit and the Indian concerns. For example, still more than 50,000 troops are stationed in the eastern Ladakh, and there have been incidences which are still fresh in the memory. For example, the Demchok and Chumar in 2013, the Doklam Plateau region in 2017, the Galwan clashes in 2020, and therefore there is a need for a time bound de-escalation roadmap also for the settlement of the border disputes. The China's military cooperation and the arms supply to Pakistan is also a matter of concern for India, and there is a mega dam which is proposed on the Brahmaputra Yarlung Sangpo in China, which may impact the lower riparian states. Also, there are concerns over the cross-border terrorism which China needs to address, and the Chinese export restrictions on the critical items also needs to be removed. For example, India imports the rare earths and the fertilizers. Now, therefore, the onus will be on Beijing to assuage the concerns of New Delhi to ensure that the new dual track strategy works. Thank you.